work for a medical services company, and we provide medical services for hospitals, we have clinics, different places like that. We literally just went through a Microsoft Teams deployment. Took about probably a year and a half to really get it done. And this is a part of that process specifically, but lessons learned, if you want to think of it that way, things that we did, things that we should have done, things like that. Breaking down that deployment barrier that you're going to see when this happens. Just a little bit about myself. Husband, 21 years, father, 19 and 15. So dealing with a kid in college during COVID and a kid in high school during COVID, going through the whole, we're in person and now we're a digital transformation. So that was my Twitter, and then that's my email address if you need to get a hold of me for anything. So Brian, you're already asking a question. Are we coming from Skype or something else? Actually, we came from a multiple different applications. We did have some Skype. We had GoToMeeting. We had Poly or Polycom capabilities, a little bit of WebEx. We also had this really funky conferencing system called WCS. So we have a lot of different, we had a lot of different conferencing tools that we were bringing down, and we finally were able to get rid of the last one 2 weeks ago. All right, so what are we talking about? Yeah, I would agree. that was a lot of fun. So we're talking about, I want to start off high level, only because the fact that it's so important. And if we don't understand what the office group is and how does team fit into it, I think it's quite important, especially from an administrative perspective, because there is a lot of overhead that can come along with an office group. So let's talk about that. Office group and teams management strategies, talking about some compliance and internal standards, of course, things that I have had to go through with my deployments that we've done. Consolidation, specifically, Brian. And then one of the things that my company has kind of glammed onto, and especially on the team side, is the team's live events. And some of the things that you can benefit from doing that, you may find that your organization is going to really, glam onto that like mine. So then what is it? How does it work? A lot of groups, I think, are having not really thinking everything through when it comes to teams. And one of the things that I've found is that needs to get a little bit more insight in or thought about is the recordings associated to teams meetings. Do you want them to go willy-nilly, or do you want to limit who has that ability, right? And you may have internal or external compliance that you have to deal with. Licensing, which I don't think anybody ever likes the idea of talking about licenses, but we're going to high level kind of talk through some of the options you have, especially with teams and meetings specifically, because that's where the complexity comes. And then user adoption and some training components. So again, talking about how to be able to get through these deployment barriers that you may have. All right, so first, what are office groups? And so let's just do this. I think most of you know that, an Office 365, Microsoft 365 now, everything starts off underlying, there is this office group that really defines, what Microsoft is doing right now in this platform, right? So it's a combination of security, because I can add people to these groups and I can add those groups into other areas. It's the email component that comes in with an office group, right? So you have a shared mailbox, you have a calendar associated to that, you have those capabilities, plus you have that SharePoint piece behind the scenes, right? So that's important to understand, because when we're in teams, some of those pieces are going to go in different areas. For example, as an administrator, you really need to know that if I were to share a file in a channel versus a chat, where does that file go? The same thing is where does that conversation go on top of that, right? So if I'm talking about files in channels, right? So SharePoint will get that file in that channel, versus if I have a chat, whether it be a group chat, single or group chat, it will drop in my OneDrive and automatically share it to everybody who has access to that. And so, troubleshooting, we need to understand those pieces. Well, what about the actual conversations that you have, where do they go, right? So we're talking about, is it in your channel? Then we're talking it's going to go into Exchange in a little compartment or a hidden area, right? As opposed to those Ingle chats, it's going to end up going, into, OneDrive, so that can be found later on, those types of things. So it's kind of important to really understand this, level of what's going on. Also understand that if you create an office group from different areas, you're going to get different things. Now we're focusing on Microsoft Teams here, so hang on, wasn't clicked on something, there we go. So let's talk about the different pieces that you get with just Microsoft Teams. And also throw this up here. If you have not been out to jump to 365.com, Matt Wade out there did an excellent job giving you the whole gambit. So if I create a group in SharePoint, what am I going to get? If I create a group in Stream, what am I going to get? What happens if I do Yammer? He did a really good job breaking those things down. But as you notice here in Teams, obviously we get the Microsoft Teams, we get the Office group, shared mailbox and calendar behind the scenes, and we get that SharePoint site. But did you know you also get a Power BI workspace, right? That workspace then allows me to be able to share, it depends upon how you have your Power BI set up, to be able to share those reports, right, to your team through that particular workspace. We also get a Stream group. Right, so those are the videos that we may be utilizing for our team. Maybe it's team meetings that I'm doing recordings of, and I want to make it available to them, and that makes it easier from a permission set of things. We have forms groups, right? So Microsoft Forms, I have the ability to be able to create a form, have my team look at it, tweak it, and then we can send it out if we need to. And that's by default, all that stuff is done behind the scenes. You can add other features to this, like, of course, Planner, which seems to be a pretty, one of those things that a lot of organizations are starting to glam onto. But again, understanding what's happening when you create an Office group, especially for Microsoft Teams, will help troubleshooting and help understand all the complexity that's happening here. All right. So then how about managing some strategies, how to be able to manage these things? So there's really 3 different strategies that I subscribe to. I personally tend to, I guess maybe it's just my SharePoint background, but I tend to go to the more, hey, I want to be able to control these groups that are being done, but that may not work for your organization, right? So you may have a smaller organization, one that they're more into technology, they're easy to be able to train and teach how to do things. You may want to go the opposite direction, right? So you have 3 kind of levels that you want to kind of think about. You have the disabled, where you're not allowing them to do self-service, right? So self-service, anybody can go in there and spin up an Office group, spin up a planner, spin up whatever they need at any given time to be able to do that. So that's an option, right, to not allow them to do it. But what does that mean for you? Well, that means that you have to have a request process in place. Whether you use ServiceNow or some other ITSM application, you have to have something in place, or you just do a SharePoint list that they go to and put the request in, and you go from there. But it is a PowerShell command to be able to limit to a security group. And that's what we have done at my company, is we've done that, and we do have a group of people that, thank you, Brian, on that. That's exactly what I was looking for. We have a group of people, that's my team, that really does those, getting those Office groups set up, getting the Microsoft Teams set up, whatever that happens to be. And we have a process through ServiceNow that allows people to very quickly determine what they need and then submit that. And it streamlines our process for us. But be realistically honest, we're probably getting 5 to 10 maximum a week when it comes to Office groups. So we're able to control it because a lot of people are already starting to use it at this point. You can limit or provisioning through limitations, but that's having a kind of a user group or a power users group that then you can then train. Then you add them into that security group that you have set up with the PowerShell, and they're the ones that are going to end up helping out with that, right? But you need to make sure they're updated as far as when to create one, when not to create one, those types of conversations, just to make sure, because you don't want them going off and running around and making things that then you're going to have to clean up later on. And then, of course, there's the self-service group creation for all, where anybody can go in there and do that. Don't need to do the PowerShell script. You don't need to worry about that. But you really want to make sure if you're going to do that, then you're going to have some other pieces in place, like making sure that we have group expiration policies in place. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. If you may even want to make sure that you have some naming conventions, right? And there are a couple of ways to be able to do naming conventions. You can automate that, or you can do other ways of manually doing that, right? But you're going to have to invest in some kind of a tool to be able to help with some of that stuff. So Brian, good question. Will you get into groups versus distribution groups? No, we're not going to necessarily talk about that, but that's a crux that a lot of companies are going through. Do we want to be able to have the overhead of a office group versus a distribution list, right? So in my mind, distribution lists are a little bit more lightweight. You have the ability to be able to give people the power to be able to update some of that stuff in office groups, right? But then they also get a SharePoint site with it. They also get all these other pieces with it, right? So I think that's something internally you guys need to talk about. Specifically when it comes to distribution groups or distribution lists versus office groups, on how best you want to handle that. My company, we still do distribution groups, and we actually invested in a tool to be able to help owners of those distribution groups be able to go and update their own DGs, right? So that tool becomes that way for them to be able to do what they need to do, and I don't have to get involved with that. Which office groups, we love that piece, right? Let them do what they need to do, right? Yeah, especially with that security-enabled DLs, absolutely. Yep. You also have to have a plan to make sure that if from an IT perspective, that security-enabled DLs or security groups are being used appropriately. I have a situation, or we have a scenario where I'm at where our security groups is a mess, and I wouldn't want to go down that route, only because of the fact that that other team and how they're still working through how to be able to clean up all the security groups. So unfortunately, we've diverged on how we do things, but that would be the best bet, is to be able to get that. So, all right. Naming convention policies. So this one's one of those scenarios, and of course you see this anytime you are talking about Microsoft and automated features, right? So if you want to be able to do an automated naming convention policy, you're gonna have to have an upgraded license, and that's the Azure AD Premium P1 license to be able to allow you to do that. But even if you don't do that, you can still have your own processes in place to say, if you're controlling these, and that's the big question, if you're controlling this, then you can then determine what your naming convention is, right? So, what's your prefix and suffix? What are those pieces that you want to have in there? You want to name it by department? You want to name it by team? Do you want to name it by project? Do you want to name it by location or even city, right? And if you're doing the automated features, right, with that P1 license, anything that's in Azure AD as far as a field that we can use is available for us to be able to create, dynamic attribute or dynamic pieces to this, right? So we can say whoever that particular user is that's requesting this, it'll take a look at the location that they're at. It'll take a look at which department they're in, and it will automatically then, based off of some of that information, would create that prefix or suffix depending upon the scenario. The other thing too is if you're going to be doing the automatic configuration, you do want to have, use the custom block words. If you're not familiar with those, then you want to make sure that, obviously somebody can't put any profanity in there because it's automated as possible. Or you may want to do reserved ones. So like HR, human resources, you have the ability as an admin to be able to go in there and create those if you need to, and then make sure those are the only created. In my organization, we have multiple levels of HR, right? And not all of them are talking to each other. So we've actually had scenarios where we've had requests for, hey, I want to get a group called Human Resources. Well, sorry, we can't do that. The automated piece would actually block that because we have that as a reserved name inside this policy. But again, you don't have to have the P1, don't have to do the policy, automatic policies. You can do this manually if you are really controlling or you have your power users helping out with controlling the creation of these groups. Another piece of this is the expiration policy. There are a subset of your Azure AD premium license that will do it, depending upon what overall license type you have in your organization. You have enterprise license type, or do you have business? Enterprises are typically going to come with this. We literally went through this process probably about 4 months ago, really going into this and really understanding how it works. The biggest things you have the ability to do is be able to set how often you want them being owners of these groups to review what's going on. And so you can set your timeline, anything 31 days above, and we're looking at every 180 days ourselves. But then you have the ability to be able to say, do you want everybody? Do you want a subset of people? You can then change that if needed. You also have to know is Microsoft did release, I think it was the latter half of last year, that additionally in here, there is this activity piece. And so basically what it will do is it will auto renew any groups that have activity in it. And they actually go through and define and say SharePoint activity, Outlook activity, or Teams activity. Then it will automatically renew it, and that owner will not get that email to be able to say, yeah, this is good. I want to renew this particular. They won't have to do that at all. So really, it's helping to be able to, if you have the self-service capabilities turned on, then it really helps you be able to keep it cleaned up after the fact, right? So that if somebody's not using it anymore, it'll soft delete. The best thing about the soft delete in Office groups, if you haven't come into it, is it's 30-day. And you can recover it if somebody goes, oh, yeah, I really needed that. Then you have that up to 30 days later, you can go and recover that if needed. All right, any questions on those sections? Very good. Okay, administrating compliance and internal standards. So this one we're going to kind of talk through, because some of the things that my company have gone through is that we do have internal regulatory standards that we have to do, and external, right? So there's a couple companies that I've worked with that they have to literally all chats have to be archived, right? So finding a third-party solution for something like that, or in this case, one of the standards that we have in our organization is emails, conversations, and chats, because they're electronic communications. We can only retain 90 days. All right, so that gives some complexity to what we have to deal with and how we train and do things. But how do we do that, right? So based off of internal standards and external standards, we have to define what we're going to control and then go in there and then decide to control it. So there's two pieces to this. And as my organization, we did the retention policy piece, right? So we were able to go in there using retention policy and say, for email, I want to be able to say email and chat for Teams and conversation for Teams, right? Unfortunately, those are two different policies. So you'll have to go into Exchange separate than Teams, right, to be able to set these up. But you can then set how you want to be able to retain it, right? If needed to retain it, say I want to be able to have this for X amount of years, right? So OneDrive, you want to say you want to retain it for 6 years, if that's the case, right? Or you're deleting content, like my 90-day conversation or electronic communication policy that we have. The other piece, which I haven't had a chance to dabble in a little bit and did a lot of reading and understanding about what's going on with this, is the configuration or using information barriers. And this is pretty important for those organizations, especially if you have that are, in financial services, and you can't have, day traders, for an example, talking to marketing because of regulatory needs. You literally have to have a barrier for communication so that they don't talk between the two. important to understand, it is a much higher license type. E5, or there's a few different compliance SKUs that you can use. But realistically, it allows you to be able to set up the group. So say, for instance, my example, I can set up a different segment for day traders, and I can set up a segment for my marketing group. And then I actually have this ability to be able to say, what kind of things that they can do between the two groups, right? And the way it works is, if I say day traders can't talk to marketing, that also means marketing can't talk to day traders, right? Or communicate back and forth. So it's important to kind of understand that. Brian, I think you're right. I think it was probably the latter half of last year that the information barriers really came. Actually, maybe it was more the beginning of this year if the information barriers were introduced. And so it's really new. And I don't know how many people have actually started using it, but I think it's a great way to be able to segment those different areas within your group, within your company. And to make sure that they're not doing, from a regulatory side of things, what they're not doing. Yep. Perfect. Thanks, Brian. All right, functionality using Teams policies. So Teams policies, before I do that. So Microsoft Teams has its own policy area. And, I know in the previous section, Pat was kind of talking about policies, and one of the last questions was wrapped around how to be able to, manage those policies. Think of policies as be able to, and by default, all the policies are enabled. Right, so I have a policy to be able to say, I want external guests to have access into my Teams, or I have a policy that says only these people can do live events, because I don't want everybody to be able to do a live event, because there's a lot of overhead on live events. So I can be able to set up policies specific like that. I can say even what apps do I want to make available. So an example, one of the things that we had, one of the tools that when I came into Mednax, we had a tool called Staff Hub. And if you're not familiar with Staff Hub, it is now called the Shifts app in Microsoft Teams. And that Staff Hub was a scheduling app. And Microsoft decided to dump that and move it into Microsoft Teams. Well, to be able to enable those groups that were using it, we created an app policy specifically for that group, and be able to expose the Shifts app on their navigation bar in Teams, as opposed to everybody else that doesn't need it, right? Because they're not constantly in it, they will have to go find it and pin it if they need to, right? So we can do those types of things to be able to either limit or give more functionality to whatever group we need to, right? But it is, we need to do it by groups, because doing individuals is going to be a nightmare to be able to manage in the future. So one thing to keep in mind, there is actually a hierarchy when it comes to giving policies, right? So if from any of you familiar with Active Directory group policies, there's always going to be policies that are going to apply to a group, and there's going to be ones that are going to supersede versus others, right? This is no exception. So you'll notice in this particular example that if I assign a policy directly to a user, that will supersede any other policies that I have. And in this case, if I say that I want to be able to have Mary be able to record, right? And there is another global policy that says everybody in the company cannot record a Teams meeting, then Mary will be able to record because of this type of hierarchy, right? Also understand that if I apply policy to a particular group, that's in there as well, right? So again, I may have another policy that adjusts some of the features within meetings. That's part of a group inheritance, right? So I apply that policy to that group. That's where that comes from. So keep that in mind, especially when you're looking at how you're setting up your policies, who's getting those policies, and getting those set up. But realistically, as we kind of talked, as you talked about before, you do have your global policies, which by default If you can use those guys. That's the best way to be able to get those policies out there, and then create custom policies where needed as exceptions to that default rule. The other thing I try to do is, anytime from an administrator perspective, I want to test something, I'm doing custom policies all the time to be able to test a product or test a feature with certain people within the organization, within my team. And we'll, literally when trying to remember which one it was, I think it was closed captioning. When closed captioning came out, I didn't enable it right away. I went in there, created a custom group, applied it to my team just to understand, what's going on, and they were able to figure out from an adoption side of things how we should approach it. So should we do a news article about it? Should we actually talk about it in one of our training sessions that we have? Those types of things. But we wanted to know what it is first before we let it loose across the organization. And of course, as you know, Microsoft sometimes doesn't give us that capability. They just push it out and everybody gets it without us being able to configure anything. So, external guests, consider guest access versus external sharing. I don't know how many of you people have actually gone into the difference between the two, but think about external sharing, and this is something that you can configure at the global across your tenant. You can configure in the different areas, so you can do it in office groups, you can do it in Teams, you can do it in SharePoint/OneDrive. But realistically, external sharing is be able to share content outside of your organization with somebody else, right? Versus a guest access where you're giving somebody access, kind of like you have an Active Directory account inside your domain. You're giving what's called an Azure AD guest account to somebody outside of your organization to be able to give them access to things more than just from a sharing perspective. So if I have a document that I want to share out to somebody at Microsoft, that would be considered an external share. But if I want to be able to have somebody from Microsoft be able to work with my team to be able to, maybe come up with a user adoption program for us, we've actually had this going on right now. We have a CSM associated to us right now that is helping us with getting a clinical buy-in to use our Office 365 teams. Because we have a lot of doctors that still refuse to be able to get into our Mednex email. They will use their own personal email, which obviously we don't want them to do that. So that's where, we're working with Microsoft, and we brought in that person using guest account access to be able to add her to my Microsoft team that's dealing with this particular project that we're working on. So again, two different concepts, but you do have to consider which way you want to go down, right? Now, the one thing I do want to mention too is for us, we've decided to lock down that guest access, and we use a feature called Azure B2B. And this actually allows us to be able to invite somebody into our organization. If they complete that, and when they complete that invitation, then it allows us to be able to add them into SharePoint or add them into a Microsoft team or an Office group as an actual account, right? So that gives us that capability of doing it. And then we have that control. That's an account that we can then control. So if I want to turn that off, I go out into Azure AD and I, disable that particular account and they're gone, right? So we have that capability of being able to do that through B2B. All right, any questions, comments? Gotta take a quick break and get some water. All right. So going back to what Brian was kind of asking before, as I kind of mentioned, we had multiple meeting platforms that we had to consolidate, and a lot of consideration I was doing. This literally took us a year to get to this point. As I was kind of mentioning, we had GoToMeeting, we had Polycom, I should say, we had some WebEx, we had some Zoom that some groups were utilizing, and then the last thing we were utilizing was the WCS, right, platform, and that was like always on conferencing dial-in type number. right? So we had those types of things to be able to consolidate, and we literally went from one app to the next and slowly whittled them down. But these apps were so embedded into processes that's why it took us over a year to be able to get to that point. So before I forget, Brian, yeah, the B2B, you want to think it's like you're whitelisting them. But basically what it does is it prevents somebody from just throwing someone's email address and sharing out a SharePoint site out to them, because we have our external sharing pieces locked down. So it has to be a named account inside our environment, and that environment being Azure AD. So yeah, it's kind of like a whitelisting, but you actually have to send them an invitation. The other thing I will mention, the other thing I would mention too is, along with that, you do have this capability of doing something called identity governance. If you haven't looked at that, I just started working on that probably 3 months ago, and it's kind of a nice little slick way. It's B2B, but then it gives it a lot easier path for people to be able to say, hey, I have a project and they need access to a SharePoint site. And I don't want to have to, and we have like 100 people that need to go into, so I don't want to have to do all these invitations. So I can set an identity governance package and literally give that person a URL, and it gives them that capability to be able to approve all the people going through that URL, and be able to, we can set up an audit. So like every 3 months, they have to go back through everybody that came through, and then, oh yeah, that person's good. Nope, that person's not good. And then they would have to go through that process. So that's a pretty powerful tool, and we're just starting to use that for a couple of our projects that we have up and running. So, all right. So some things to think about from a consolidation process, right? So you have determine the workflows and the use cases, and this is where, at the beginning we had a lot of work to do, and especially when it came to our executive admins, because they were so used to utilizing this WCS product. So basically what that product would do is you would get an assigned conference number and ID, and you could just go to it at any time that you wanted to, right? So it's always on. Executives would not send an invite. They would send an email saying, hey, can you join me here now and let's have a conversation, right? And it could be to 3 or 4 people. So that was one of the things that we had to account for as we were, migrating, because Teams doesn't have that, right? So what we had to do is we had to train the executive admins to say, well, if you want to have something like that, you need to go into the future, put an invite there about 3 to 6 months out into the future, and then use that for the next 6 months if you want to do something like that. Or just get used to, hey, if there's a meeting, just throw an invite, because they didn't use invites. Our executive admins didn't use them well. And so there was a little bit of Outlook 101 and how to be able to do those things to be able to quickly get a meeting set up. We also had to take into consideration that a lot of the people coming into these meetings, they didn't have Microsoft Teams on their phones, right? So, and they were used to dial-in. So, we would have to deploy the audio conference license associated to Teams to give them that call-in number. Now, I'm happy to say that call-in number feature is being used less and less and less, because we have more proliferation of the Microsoft Teams apps, especially on mobile devices. But, again, determine your workflows and your use cases, right? Internal, external training, project meetings, right? What are those things that you're going to be doing? If taking a look at the internal, external meeting side, we have a lot of groups that are training our clinical. And so their requests were always, hey, I want to be able to have it interactive, or it could go to, I really don't need it interactive. I just need to be able to tell them and have them, type in a question. And so we would have to work with them to give them the right solution. So that's where live events came to be very important for us as an organization, and being able to train the trainers to be able to use the team meetings appropriately. What features do the employees use the most, right? So the understanding in a particular given situation, if they're project managing, they may want to have a whiteboard, right? So being able to have a whiteboard, being able to, in this case, we actually brought in a Surface Hub, 1st gen or 2nd gen, to be able to actually have groups use that to be able to do that in a meeting. And that cart would go around all over the place when we brought it in, because they were utilizing it for these Microsoft Teams meetings. And then, about meeting chat, do we need it, right? In some situations, we may not need that meeting chat, because they really wanted to be able to, have that conversation. They didn't want to do a live event, but they didn't want to have that conversation. So we were able to then, train them on how to remove the meeting chat from that particular meeting, or we set up a policy for that for them. What do they have for hardware? Wired, wireless handsets, and be able to accommodate them, because in the other tools, maybe all they did was their phone, right? So, do we need to replace their phone with the Teams-enabled phone to be able to handle it? Or can we just get them a speakerphone or a headset, right? So headset, so that they can just very easily throw that on and have that conversation if they need to. And then training. Of course, all this stuff will lead up to that training and how we're going to account for the differences between the old platforms to the new. As I was mentioning, the WCS platform, it was a simple training thing. They were able to do that. I was actually surprised that we didn't get a lot of pushback on that, but we were able to get through that process because of that. And then, of course, training is ongoing features. That was a pretty big deal when the Teams meeting bar that was hidden during most of the time, and now all of a sudden it's the upper right-hand corner. A lot of people were having a problem trying to find that anytime they were in a meeting, right? So now it's right there. Or some of the other features, especially like with the background images and those types of things, you need to account for that. People are going to want to do that, right? And use those features. Other considerations. So in our particular scenario, we already had a Cisco PBX behind the scenes. We were utilizing that. The company is getting into Ring Central because we're going more virtual, so they need to be able to have a soft phone type thing. We even considered using Microsoft Teams for that, but we do have some limitations, right? So other considerations we have to think about. Do we want to use maybe another hosted model? In this case, we already had an investment with Ring Central. Could we use that as the cloud PBX for Microsoft Teams? The answer is actually yes. And there are a couple other ones out there that allows us to be able to do it. And what it will do for Teams is Ring Central will take over the controls. Say, for instance, I'm having a one-on-one conversation with somebody. You will notice that the controls to do a chat, or the controls to do video call, or just a regular audio call will change to orange. That indicates that that's a Ring Central backend, as opposed to the purple that we normally see, right? So if I click on that call, it'll allow me to be able to get into Ring Central, and then I can start the conversation from there. But I start in Teams as opposed to having to go to the Ring Central app to be able to do those calls, right? So I'm always working from Microsoft Teams in this case. They also have apps for that. I say that jokingly because there's always an app for something here. So that app, you can do a WebEx call app where you literally pin it onto your left nav. You click on it, you're able to then do those calls straight from there, but it's using WebEx behind the scenes. Or you actually have the same thing with Ring Central app, right? So you can go in there and click on it, and it gives you the ability to be able to call. But again, you have to have that, in this case, Ring Central app embedded or on that particular computer to be able to work. We did look at the Ring Central thing. We can control if chat is being controlled by Ring Central, if video conference or audio conference is being controlled by Ring Central. So we have that capability of turning those Ring Central features off. And if, for instance, we turn off chat, then it turns purple to say it was a Teams chat versus being a Ring Central chat, those types of things. Also, got to talk about conference rooms. Conference rooms are a big deal, especially with Teams and Teams meetings. There's a couple different ways of handling this. You can utilize your existing hardware. So a lot of companies, over the last couple of years have put a lot of money and time into their current conferencing systems. There are different video interrupt services that are out there right now. For us, we actually use Poly because we had a connection with Polycom ahead of time. And they had this thing called the Real Connect service that actually allowed us to be able to take our existing Cisco hardware and connect it into Teams meetings, or actually allow us to be able to connect into a Teams meeting, and we just have to invite the room and it goes right into the Teams meeting. It shows up. If I'm on my computer, I'm in a Teams meeting, I see them. If they're there, they see it on whatever the hardware platform they use, and it goes into the exact same meeting. So it gives me that interim until maybe I feel, you know what, we're good. I think we've used our investment. Maybe I want to upgrade to now Teams rooms, right, or MTRs. And that's the next piece, is Microsoft Teams rooms. This is a pretty hot item now. I remember actually going to Microsoft Ignite, obviously now, not this last year, but the year before. And I sat down with Poly. At the time, they just literally changed names from Polycom to Poly. And they were doing some different hardware, showing us some of the new innovations they were coming up with, the Teams rooms concepts and ideas. And we eventually ended up going in and replacing all of our conference rooms at our headquarters with Teams rooms and got rid of our Cisco hardware. But really, I mean, it's actually a pretty nice platform. It utilizes an Android app on these devices, and the devices come from, Poly, Logitech, Yalink, Creston, and so on and so forth. And they're different sizes depending upon the types of spaces that you are utilizing, right? So Microsoft, if you go out to there, and I have a series of links at the end of this deck, one of them goes to looking at the different size rooms they have and the different hardware options that you have. If you've not been out to that website, it actually does a really good job breaking it down into what you're trying to figure out for that particular space and your options. For us, we actually ended up going with a majority of our rooms, which were the medium-sized room with an HP Slice G5, and that worked really, really well. It comes with the panel, and the nice thing is that you get is that things like that one-touch join. Yes, presence does get reflected into that. So as well as being able to, I know a lot of the devices now, if you're utilizing a Windows device and you have Teams set up and you have a proximity set up, you actually can then do add this room to that meeting, happen to be right by that room and nobody's in it. You can literally jump into that room for a quick meeting if you need to, those types of things. Team casting, so if I'm in that meeting, I can just quickly plug in, get my desktop to share in that, and then of course the whiteboard, getting that up there and running, and so people can use that within that meeting room. It's a pretty nice little deal. The other thing that comes along with that is how do you manage these things? And there are one of the things that we ended up doing, we took advantage of an offer that Microsoft had. It was a fast track program around Microsoft Teams rooms, and that fast track program still exists, by the way. That actually allows you, if you do have access to fast track, allows you to be able to have Microsoft come in and they will install 2 rooms for free for you as part of that POC. Obviously, they want you to be able to do 2 rooms, and then they want you to do the rest of them, right? But keep that in mind, that if you do have fast track, you may be able to get into these Teams rooms and do that. But one of the things that I found when we did that fast track program is they got us involved with the Microsoft Teams Managed Room Premium service, and this is newer. This was probably about the beginning of this year that this really came from preview into actual GA. And what this does, the premium service gives us this ability to be able to have additional monitoring, and it's real time, guys. And it literally is, if something happened, like something gets unplugged, it will tell you the monitor got unplugged, or something is hanging because of a reboot, right? Or it will actually allow you to automate the updates to these particular devices where they happen to be. And it's connected into support on top of that, right? So it allows me to be able to open up a ticket right there in that portal, and then they can see it, right? So support, literally, you got the 24/7, support there, allowing you to be able to get that taken care of pretty quickly, right? But that is an additional cost on top of your meeting rooms license that you have set up, all right? So we'll talk about licensing here in a little bit. There's a standard that you just get with that meeting room license, and that allows you to be able to go into the Teams console, and in there you have this ability to be able to see devices. There's also other areas, specifically things like your bars and those types of other devices that you have that you will see, but there's a Teams room, and it does allow you to be able to do updates and configuration policies and diagnostics. I know that I've looked in there a few times. I got a lot more information from the premium. I mean, we'll use it if we got it, right? Type of scenario. But I would highly, if you have the ability to be able to go into it, it's really nice. It's really slick. Get email updates all the time on things that are maybe not working, and then we're able to either it takes care of it itself depending upon the scenario, or then we can have somebody go over to that room and do whatever it actually literally says what we can do. So I love that particular product that they have. Any questions? All right, let's talk about Teams live events. Anybody use live events? Anybody play around with them at all? Oh, good. Got a couple people. They're way different. I'll tell you, as we started having groups start using a live event, we actually had to have two people, sit down. My team all sat down and we worked on this, and we came up with a lot of information to be able to help us understand and then document it so that we can teach other people to do it. But really, what is a live event? A live event is something that's not just associated to Teams. You can actually do live events from Stream. You can do a live event from Yammer as well, but I'm focusing on the Teams side of this. And yes, Brian, you definitely need a monitor for that event, and I'll talk about that here in a second. It's a streaming platform for your broadcast events. That's the easiest way to be able to say it. It is different than Teams meetings like this one here, because you don't get this type of look and feel. You literally get excuse me. You literally get what we call the producer view. Okay, so if you notice this particular top level, you notice this picture here. This is what that producer is going to see. There's going to have the queue on the left side. There's going to be the live event on the right side, and you literally have somebody come up and queue something up and say, hey guys, I'm ready for this. We're going to send it over and we're going to go live with it. And on top of that, you do need to have somebody go in there and moderate. As Brian was saying, you definitely need to have that. That's what we've found. I know that I take a look at the Microsoft documentation and they say you need a producer. Hang on here. There we go. An organizer, a producer, a moderator, or no, they say organizer, producer, presenter, and attendees are the roles. However, I found that you do need a moderator, because what happens is that the producer tends to get a little bit caught up on making sure the right person is talking at the right time and those things, that having a moderator just focusing on the QA discussion, if you have that up and running and using it, it's going to be important, right? So keep that in mind. It is meant for a one-to-many type scenario, right? So in this case, in Teams, we're doing something like this because I want to have interaction with you, speaking and those types of things. But really, a live event, it's a one-way streak, right? You're going to have a presenter present, and then everybody else will not be able to talk, right? That's kind of one of the number one things when I'm trying to do a Microsoft Teams event, and I have some people that are unmuting themselves all the time, right? In this case, they don't even have a chance, right? It's all QA if you have that QA enabled. Think of it like a town hall event or those types of things, or a training event that you can use for the live events. Have a production team to be able to actually produce the content. Attendees can interact via the Q&A panel, access meeting from team, web browser, or even a mobile device that has Microsoft Teams on it. And if you do find that you're doing this a lot, then you can get a third-party ECDN to be able to offload that distribution of the content or the streaming content, so that it doesn't hit your network. And then you do actually have features. By the way, every single live event gets automatically recorded. I've tried to find a way to be able to disable that because of our internal policies. We can't. There's not a way to be able to disable. That's just part of live events. And then you do get the attendee reports, and that's whoever organizes these events has access to the recordings after the fact, as well as the attendee reports. You do have the ability when you're setting up a live event to be able to say, I want the attendees to get that the recording as well, and it will give them a link to that file as well. So depending upon how you have it set up. But to be able to get things in place, your organizer needs to have at least an E3 license and has access to Microsoft Stream, because there is actually some components in Stream to be able to set this up. So there is a policy in Teams that is the live events policy. And as you notice in this particular screenshot, to allow scheduling, that's the top #1 thing. Do you want to allow transcriptions for attendees, which might be a good thing? Who can schedule the live events, right? Who can join, I should say, and then who can record the event, right? Those are the options you have with this. And this is where I ended up because we didn't want everybody to be able to do a live event. We had a subset. Then we created a custom policy for this to be able to allow them to be able to use Stream or to use Teams live event and just those people. And then we apply it to them. On the Stream side, you actually have to go into the admin setting and go into live events and turn it on first, and then put your unrestricted users on to be able to do that, right? If they're not on this list, they're not going to be able to do it. And then once this is enabled, give it a little bit of time. They go in to do a new Teams meeting. They will be able to get to, in the calendar in Teams, you click on the new event, and you'll have live event as an option sitting there. All right. Recordings. Learned a couple things about recordings, only because of the fact that our company decided they wanted to be able to restrict some of these recordings. And so we do have the ability to be able to enable or disable users from using recording. And it's in the meeting policies, and you just uncheck the box, allow cloud recording. But then you can apply it to a group if you want to be able to do it. And so that's where later on we created a custom policy and assigned it to a group of people through a security group, that then people are added to that if we ever want to enable them to be able to get this policy, this Teams recording policy, because they've gone through the necessary process to be able to have legal say yes, right? So we have that. But really, under the policy, then those people then would be able to then start those recordings. If you've not been in this, you've probably seen this when we did this meeting. You saw the disclaimer. The video will be available in Teams meetings, chats, or channels. But I don't know how many of you guys have gotten this change yet, but it is changing. So the video normally would all go up to Stream. However, Microsoft did announce that it's going to change that, and that's going to go into OneDrive. If it's a chat or channel conversation, or if it's a meeting that is in a channel specifically, it will go into SharePoint, right? So if I schedule a channel meeting, then it will go right into there. Everything else will go into OneDrive, then you're able to share it from there. I'm wondering, anybody has seen that in their tenant yet? Has it changed over? Because I heard there was some people that were starting to get it. I know we haven't gotten it quite yet. So we're just waiting for the day for that to happen and be able to train all those people who can record to be able to know where to go for that. And then how to be able to move it to Stream if they eventually want to do that. All right. Licensing for Teams. And this is high level. I'm not going to get into too much because, if we started talking about licensing, we could be here for 2 or 3 hours, and we don't want to do that. But from a Teams perspective, there's some specific things that we want to take a look at, right? So Teams is a part of all the business, and when I mean business, I'm talking about like the business standard and enterprise version licensing that you have there. And I broke it down into desktop, web, collaboration meetings, video calls, audio calls, and telephony. By default, this is what you get with these particular ones. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get it as an addition to that particular license that you have. but you have this ability to be able to do add-ons later on if you want to bring that capability in place. But you will notice that everything up until the E5 license type actually does include the audio calls and telephony, but everything else does get the video calls. You have those capabilities, web or desktop, across the board. If you're not familiar with the F3 license, this one is they just changed the name not that long ago. It used to be an F1 license specifically, and that one was web only, right? However, I'm not sure how many of you guys know, but even if you do have an F1 for Teams, you still can use that with a desktop version of Teams. That's different than the rest of the Office suite, because if I have an F1, F3 license, then I don't get the desktop apps. Outlook, I don't get Word, Excel, PowerPoint, I don't get OneNote, those apps. You get those when you get to the E3 level, but that's different for Teams. Teams, we get the desktop across the board. So very happy about that part. Add-ons, we do have a few add-ons that you can then augment what you have currently in your organization, right? So you have, for the business SKUs, you can add on your Microsoft 365 Business Voice, and that gives you the ability, and this is primarily under 300 users. The phone system capability, which gives you that cloud PBX piece. The audio conference licensing, which allows us to be able to have a dial-in for Teams meetings, and then the domestic call plan, which allows us to be able to call out. Then you do have a separate phone system SKU that you can just apply, right? So you would have to do that, and maybe you want to get a call plan so that you have that outside number type of thing. So you hosted PBX, right? So in the example I was talking about before, from a hosted PBX, we could have used Ring Central. We chose not to, but we could have done that. In this case, we could then use the Microsoft Teams licensing and then have the hosted PBX piece, or which would include, voicemail, caller ID, call forwarding, auto attended, those types of things. As I mentioned, the audio conference licensing, that's really about the Teams meeting dial-in, so that I get a conference dial-in and a code, so that when somebody's calling in from their phone, they don't have Teams app on their phone, they can go right in. Toll-free numbers, which we can use for audio conference and auto attendant. The call plans, which get that external phone number, and I can do a couple different flavors, domestic or international, right? Of course. And then the Teams rooms, which is important for any of your Teams rooms themselves. In fact, our scenario, we ended up doing Teams rooms, and I think we did the call plan because we wanted to have the rooms be able to call all out to an external conference ID if we needed to, or conference call if we needed to do that. One of the nice things that I know that Teams meetings is Teams rooms now apps are actually able to go into WebEx meetings now. So if you were to get a WebEx meeting and you forward it to that Teams room, now it'll actually work with that WebEx meeting. So those things are now starting to become a little bit easier to be able to. And then there's the big one, the Advanced Communications License. And this one is really meant for those organizations that are really taking advantage or have a large amount of people that they have to have conversations with, right? Or have these big, large meetings with. Think about your live event types things that have over 20,000 attendees. And if you're putting on a big conference, like maybe a Microsoft Ignite or something like that, 20,000 attendees and 50 concurrent sessions, right? You can do those types of things using the advanced communications package that you have. Or you can do Teams meetings, up to 1,000 people that are participating, like in a collaboration setting like this, or I can go up to 20,000 people on a Teams meeting if I'm doing it more one way, right? So that they wouldn't be able to chat, they wouldn't be able to unmute, they wouldn't be able to do those things. But that's at a premium, that particular license. The other thing I do like about it is you can actually have a customized lobby for people to come in, that you have a specific display about what to do and how to be able to do that. And then of course, monitoring and analysis of the meetings and events that happen. I don't know many people who have gone this route yet. And this advanced communications license, I'm trying to remember, I think it just literally came available over the last 3 months. So it's a newer SKU. User adoption and training, and this is definitely one thing that you need to kind of focus on, especially if you're trying to get over the deployment barriers. And I'm not going to focus on a lot of big things, but I'm going to focus on one thing that everybody has this capability of pushing out and using. And you don't necessarily have to be an expert on content curation when it comes to using this. But think about this from the perspective of you need to account for different learning styles. And when I talk about user adoption, I'm also talking about training along with that. And so you're going to have people that love to do, like a live event type thing, right? So a meeting like this where you're getting a training kind of in person, or actually doing in-person training, right? So obviously with COVID, that's a little bit harder at this point, but at one time, you can do that. So we actually did in-person trainings with our teams rollout. I'll talk about it in my other session later on today. We did some buzz events, and those went off really, really well. We had a little mini conference all wrapped around Microsoft Teams, giveaways, the whole 9 yards. And that really helped a lot of people because they were able to connect with us and have that. But then there's some people who couldn't make it, or they just don't do that type of connection with people. So we had virtual events, right? So, or they just like to read, or they want to watch a video. So think about those types of things. So provide the video, the FAQ or live training options to them in a timely manner, and create a schedule as you're doing this project or moving teams and doing a particular thing with teams. Decide when you're going to be able to offer these trainings. We've gotten to a point where now we're kind of doing the back end or post, right? So think about pre or during, and then post. How are you going to continue on with those trainings? We're actually in a track right now where we're doing remedial or 101 type training sessions for new employees as they're coming into the organization about Microsoft Teams, because we've had that much adoption of the platform. The one thing I would highly suggest to everybody is, if you have not looked at the Microsoft 365 Learning Pathway site, I highly, highly recommend it. This is something that you can actually find if you're not familiar with the SharePoint Lookbook provisioning tool. Go out and just search for, and actually have the link for the lookbook, I believe, at the end of this deck. Look for the lookbook, and then you're going to try to find the Learning Pathways site. And you have to be a tenant admin to be able to deploy. But the nice thing about it is a lot of that content that's already out on Microsoft support training side of things is going to be already provisioned and in there. On top of that, you can add your own custom content, right? Or you can remove something. So say, for instance, you are not enabling a particular feature, right? So you can actually remove that from that pathway site, and then you can add your own content in there. Maybe it goes to a SharePoint page, or it goes to a video that you already created for that particular change. You have the ability to be able to do that. And very quickly get this spun up. The nice thing about it is it's updated quarterly, and you don't have to do anything about it, right? The content gets updated behind the scenes, which I love that part about this particular product. The other thing too is, anytime we are talking about user adoption, it is very important to understand what's happening behind the scenes. And if you have not had the opportunity to look at the Microsoft Usage Analytics, this is powered by Power BI, and it's focusing really on the overall adoption. Now, there are other charts, graphs, information that you can then pull from the admin console. But really, this gets into a lot more of the details that you need to be looking at. So you notice the analytics reports in the upper right-hand corner here. This is the out-of-the-box features that we have inside Microsoft Teams, or inside Office 365. But in here, you'll also see this is the top view, or the main executive dashboard when it comes to the Microsoft 365 usage information. And it does give you a snapshot over time what's going on. So this one happens to be October 2019. But if you were to go into the details for Microsoft Teams, you can actually see the last year's worth of information as far as what happened with your particular adoption, right? And it even gives you the ability to be able to dive in to say, hey, what areas within Teams are we using more than others, We find as an organization, we are very chat heavy. I think consistently over 2019, I would say starting probably in March, we have been over 1 million chat instances every month. And that's a lot of chat, but then that allows us to be able to say, hey guys, we're doing a lot of chat, but what about the channel conversations? Are we utilizing channels? How are we doing in those other areas? And then we can actually see, if we tailor our training, we can then see, is that working or not working, right, over time. So it really gives us some really nice focal pieces. You do need to have Power BI Pro to be able, a license to be able to get this running, and you have to be a tenant admin to get it up and running in the first place. But once it's enabled, then you can go ahead and share that. It refreshes behind the scenes, and it works really, really well. I highly suggest it if you have the opportunity to use it. All right, well, guys, gals, any questions that you guys may have? I will take that as you got everything you need. So thank you. And then I do have, and I'll make sure these are shared. I do actually have resources, the things that I was kind of talking about before. And I think, Brian, you may have sent something in there. I think I have that one on here as well. So thank you, everybody. If you don't have any questions, Tim, any follow-up, anything that we need to do?
Yeah, I'm going to post here our next session, which is the 12 o'clock session here. We also have a gift card to give away for the session participants here. But if you look in the chat, I posted the noon session. There's only one session over lunch. It's going to be acknowledgements from 2020, which will be great. But thank you very much, Donald. That was great. There's a lot of information in there that I think is extremely useful. What I'm going to do now here is I kind of kept track of the participants in chat that were participating in the conversations, and I have listed them in a random generator if I can find it amongst my 1.5 million tabs that are open here. 1 second. And I am going to run, and I have Beth Beck as the winner. Beth, are you here? I did see her drop.
Yeah, I think she dropped.
Okay, we're going to do another winner then, because you do have to be present here. Jake Meyer, are you here, Jake? You can just ping in chat. Oh, yep, you're still here. All right, perfect. Congrats. I will get, yeah, congrats, Jake. But thank you very much, Don. Like I said, that link in the meeting, otherwise you can find it on the webpage, but the link in the chat might be the best way to join the next meeting here. So. All righty.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.